Communion is a time for the church to gather together. It is a time for us to focus on Christ, what he has done for us and what he's doing and what he's going to do. And that's where our heart and mind ought to be. And I always try to be really smooth when I do communion, but it seemed at Tinker Air Force Base, when I was doing the, preaching at the 8 o'clock service. The 8 o'clock service was very formal, and it was done with a lot of decorum. And one Sunday morning, it was Communion Sunday, and I had on a suit, a black suit, and a white shirt, and a tie, and it came time to do the cup, and I picked up the lid, and I thought, that's really heavy. I thought, why is that so? It's empty. There's no juice in there. Well, it had all stuck in the lid, and I got it about this high, and it crashed out, and all the juice and wine went on my white shirt. It was really smooth. It went really well. Another time, same service, went through all the pre-communion verbiage, if you will, and lifted the lid. It was very light, and there were no elements in there. Someone forgot to fill it up. But that's not our case today. I checked it. The lid's working, and we're good. There is a passage in 1 Corinthians 11 where we really get instruction for taking communion and what it's supposed to do for us. If you turn to 1 Corinthians 11, beginning at 17, Paul begins to give instruction on the Lord's Supper. Now, don't think that we're doing things wrong here, because we're not. And a lot of times when a preacher preaches on 1 Corinthians, it may be that he has an idea that things aren't going so well in the church because things weren't going well in the church at Corinth. Paul just ended a section on women in the church and the head covering in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We're not going to talk about that today, but I can at some time if you want me to. I did a lot of work on that passage back when I was in seminary, and a lot of people think, well, the head covering, it was just a cultural thing and it doesn't apply to us. Not true. It does. But that's a different sermon for a different day. But I notice none of you women have head coverings on. There's a reason for that. And that's okay. And then we come to verse 17, and Paul says this, "Now in giving this instruction, in this next instruction, I do not praise you, because you come together not for the better, but for the worse." Paul had just got done praising the church at Corinth because of the way that they were handling the whole women in ministry issue. But now he turns his attention to communion, and he says, "I do not praise you." That's a litotes. That's the word for that. It's a grammatical device, and Paul simply said, "I do not praise you." What he's saying is, I'm really condemning you, right, for what's happening here, and we're going to see why. He says, "Because you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you, and in part I believe it. For there also have to be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you." Very confusing verse. I probably won't comment on it again. Verse 20. "Therefore, when you come together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For when you eat, each one takes his own supper first, and one goes hungry while another gets drunk. What? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? When am I to say to you, shall I praise you? In this I do not praise you. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is a new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy way shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But a person must examine himself, and in so doing he is to eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For the one who eats and drinks judgment to himself if he does not properly recognize the body. For this reason, many among you are weak and sick, and a number are asleep. But if we judged ourselves rightly, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are disciplined by the Lord so that we will not be condemned along with the world. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, have him eat at home, so that you do not come together for judgment. As to the remaining matters, I will give instruction when I come. So here is our instruction from Paul, how we are to conduct communion when we gather together as a church. And if we do it properly, it really creates a great sense of community, because each one of us individually will grow closer to Christ, and in doing so, we will grow closer to one another. And this is the goal that Christ has for the church, that we be unified. The church at Corinth was not unified. There were factions and divisions. You saw that as I read through this passage. And a lot of it had to do with what was taking place when they gathered together for the agape feast and then for communion. So the early church at this time, they would actually have two separate events, and Paul's talking about both of them here. First was the agape feast. They would gather together and eat as a body of believers, which has a great unifying sense about it. When a church gathers together to eat and fellowships together, it really is powerful. And following that, they would then have communion, where they would formally recognize the death of Jesus Christ, looking back to the cross, partaking of the elements together. But the agape feast really got out of hand for them. And as I read through the passage, hopefully you picked that up. There were actually three different groups of people. There were the wealthy people, and they would come together. Then there were the common people, probably people like you and me. And then there were the slaves. Now, what was happening, they were bringing food, and initially, I'm sure it worked really well. They probably had like a potluck kind of a thing, and everybody shared their food. But as people are people, and we seem to be wired this way, eventually all the rich people began to sit together, all the common people began to sit together, and all the slaves began to sit together. And you can imagine what happened if they brought food from their homes. The rich people over here were having a feast. It was great. It was great to be rich. And the common people, well, they had enough, it was sufficient. And then the slaves were sitting over here eating absolutely nothing. And that's the way the agape feast became at the Corinth church, at the church at Corinth. And Paul said, this ought not to be. He says, what? Don't you have houses to eat in? It'd be better if you just stayed home and ate, rather than doing this, because people are being ostracized. People are being pushed to the side. There is no unity. And it is absolutely imperative that the church constantly work together on unity, that we look out for all believers. And it's a great thing when we do this, when the church is unified, when we take care of everyone. We take note of what other people are going through. This is what Christ had in mind for the body of believers. And it's a fantastic thing when it happens. In my church in North Carolina, we had a lady who came without her husband, and she was excessively wealthy. How wealthy? Well, her husband was the president of American Tobacco. And then we had another little lady that came to the church. You can talk about the ethics of American Tobacco later. But anyhow, they were very, very wealthy, as you can imagine. I was talking to him once, and you just couldn't believe the profit in cigarettes at that time. It's just amazing. He said, we don't care how much we get sued. He said, you literally can't count the profit. That's what he said, quote. I don't know why I just told you that. But so we had this lady, very wealthy, and then we had this great little old lady, and I was only in my 30s at the time, so she was probably 60, right? So, but she was just a common person. She was a fantastic cook. She could cook, and she had goats at her house, and she would always say, oh, Pastor Jeff, with that southern accent, aren't you going to come see the goats? And I'm going to cook for you. And she would always grab my arm and hang on to it as she talked to me. And she said, I just tell people to come to our church. You got to see our pastor. He's so good looking. She wore glasses. Yeah. But these two ladies were such great friends, and they did things together. And that's what does that? Well, that would never happen at a garden club. The little old lady would never attend the garden. It would never happen at any other place, but it happens in the church, because this is what God has in mind for the church, that we come together in unity, that we work together. And that wasn't happening in the Corinth church. And it ought to happen at every church. And every time we partake of communion together, it ought to remind us the one thing that we have in common is we are all sinners and we need to be saved by grace. And that only happens at the cross. And when we partake of communion, it makes us reflect back on the cross. We have to work at this. I think we're wired for exclusivity, if you can imagine. We're almost wired to be separate from other people. These people aren't like us. We're like this. They can stay over there. We'll stay over here, and we'll all be happy. But that's not the church. One of the places it happens is often between generations. The older people don't understand the younger people. And I haven't seen any of that in this church, which is just great. We who are older have snow on the roof. We just love the young people, and I see the young people respecting the elders. It's a great thing. But we always have to be aware and work at it. I had 2 new patients that I saw this past 2 weeks, both in their 90s. And when I was talking to them, it just was such a reminder of what treasures they are. One World War II vet, and hearing his stories, just incredible. There aren't too many of those people left. You know, that the other a Korean War veteran, and just to hear their stories. And it reminded me of something I read a long time ago. This is by Kent Nearborn. It's called Letters to My Son. And I'm going to read it for you, if that's okay. So here's a father writing letters to his son, and the topic of this letter he wrote to his son is age. And he wrote this: "Your heart is revealed in the way you treat the elders. Like children, they are a burden, but unlike children, they offer no hope or promise. They are a weight and an encumbrance, and a mirror of our own mortality. It takes a person of great heart to see past this fact and to see the wisdom the elders have to offer, and to serve them out of gratitude for the life they have passed on to us. It is not easy in this culture. We have lost a feel for our elders. They are a sad, gray presence, hidden behind clumsy phrases like elderly, senior citizen, retired persons. They are tolerated out of guilt, feared for the burden they represent, or shunted aside into irrelevance. They are not honored or loved or sought out for the wisdom their years have given to them. But no matter how they make you feel, you should always watch them carefully. For they were you, and you will be them. You carry the seeds of your old age within you at this very moment. And they hear the echoes of their childhood each time they see you. Even if they have lived the most simplest, most ordinary of lives, they have seen the world in which you have come. No other past generation is as close to yours, no other life so near in time. Their stories have the blood of your life running through them. You will never be so close to the world that gave you birth as when you are speaking to them. And for that, and that alone, you should honor and revere them and give them your ear. You are bonded to them in time." The elderly. And yet, sometimes the elderly kind of push the younger generation aside, don't they? I had some people in a church doing that one time, and I reminded them that we just fought a war on 2 fronts with a completely volunteer army of people in their 20s. So don't shunt the youth aside either, right? God has called us together as a church, young and old, and every time we gather together for communion, it ought to bind us together as we grow closer to the cross and closer to one another. So it builds us into maturity as a body every time we share communion together. What a fantastic thing. And yet also, as you and I partake of communion together, speaking of age, I need my glasses again. That's terrible. As you and I gather together for communion, we grow more mature individually. And when we grow together when we grow as individuals, we can't help but grow together as a body. Paul uses two phrases in this passage. He said, "What are there not divisions among you?" Notice that in verse 18. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you. These were the people that were sitting, slaves, rich, common people. So we had those divisions. But then he uses a stronger word in verse 19. For there also have to be factions among you. And that happens when they start shooting at one another, right? We are of Paul. We are of Christ, right? We are of Apollos. And they begin shooting at one another. And Paul said, if you're doing that, it's better not even to come together for communion. Just stay in your homes. Don't you have houses to eat in? So we work through these divisions, and we work through this maturity process. And Paul now tells us what we are to do as individuals when we gather together for communion. And here I love the way this passage is put together. We begin to grow individually. Paul says in verse 27, if a person partakes of communion unworthily, unworthily, what does he mean here? Well, the word picture that he's drawing, you've seen those old scales. Well, if you watch Gold Rush, when they come in with their gold and they weigh it out, well, they don't do that with that scale. Never mind. But you've seen the old scales where one tray is on this side, one on the other, and the thing hangs. That's the word picture that Paul has here. And he said, picture this. You have the wine and the bread on this side, and on this side you put your attitude, you put your belief, you put all that you are, and it ought to balance out. And if it doesn't balance out, then you are partaking of communion in an unworthy manner. And that's exactly what was happening at this church in Corinth. They were getting together for their love feast. Everyone was eating except for the slaves. And some of the people were drinking so much wine, by the time it came for communion, they were even drunk. And now they're taking this communion, and it's just out of control. And Paul said, this is in an unworthy manner. And he says in this passage, when you do this, it is as if you are, what is the verse I am looking for? Verse 27, therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks of the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. Guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. What does that mean? I don't know. There are so many different ideas about that, and no one's really come up to a conclusion. But I know it's bad. Why? Because what's the penalty? Paul says, for this reason, some of you are sick, and some even sleep. So the penalty is bad. So you do not want to partake of communion in an unworthy manner. So what does Paul do here? He says then, as we prepare for communion, we ought to prepare ourselves individually. And he really gives us a great way to do this. What does he say? Well, let's look at this passage. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, when the night he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way also, he took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So Paul then goes on to tell us to determine if we are worthy. So what's he saying? Well, think about communion this way. We want to look three ways when we partake of communion. The first place, we want to look inward. Am I worthy to receive communion today? Am I doing this in a respectful manner? Have I taken care of the relationships within the church? Remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. If you are going to present your offering at the altar, and you get there at the altar with your offering, and then you remember, oh, my brother has something against me, what am I to do? I'm to leave the altar, take my offering with me, make it right with my brother, and then I come back and make my offering. So we look inward. We look inward. Am I following Christ? Am I looking to the cross? Am I trusting in him for salvation and in him alone? If so, then I am ready to partake of communion together. Look inward as we prepare for communion. And then we're to look in another direction as well. The verse says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." But we're also looking back to the cross, aren't we? "For I received from the Lord the night in which he was betrayed, he took bread." You remember the sermon I preached a couple weeks ago? This is a test. No, don't worry about it. I don't even remember what I preached on half the time. You're driving through South Dakota, and you see all the wall drug billboards. And Paul said in Galatians, Jesus was betrayed before you like a placard, like a billboard. Well, that's what happens at communion. When you and I gather together for communion, we ought to be looking back to the cross. We ought to constantly have our eyes focused on the cross. What has Christ done for me? So we look inward and we look backward, back to the cross, back to where Christ shed his blood for us. We look there, look forward, look inward, look back to the cross, and then we look forward. Paul says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So communion ought to also remind us to look forward to what Christ shall do. He's coming again. He's coming back. And what a great thought as we see culture slipping away, as we see things we don't like. As a reminder, when we partake of communion, God is still building his church. What a great thing. God is still building his church. And all around the world, which gets so exciting when you think about that. And he's still in control. His hand is still moving history. Look back to the cross. Look inward to what Christ has done for you. Look forward. One writer wrote this: "Calvary is a divine means whereby destitute men, through faith, contact elevating power and rise to hope and happy expectation. Calvary is more than the lighthouse for sinking souls. It is a lifeline for their salvation." Look back to the cross as we gather for communion today. In Armenia, a missionary ran across a woman who was called by her husband's name, but the husband wasn't around. And the missionary found out that the husband actually gave his life. There had been an earthquake, and the schoolhouse began to collapse. This man ran in, he saved all the children, and then the schoolhouse collapsed on him. So to honor him, they called his wife by his name and never used her name again. It was a great honor. He gave up his life for others. And one Christian writer, taking that account, wrote this: "Beneath the rubble of a fallen world, he pierced his hands," Jesus. "In the wreckage of a collapsed humanity, he ripped open his side. His children were trapped, so he gave his blood. It was all he had. His friends were gone. His strength was waning. His possessions had been gambled away at his feet. Even his father had turned his head. The blood was all he had, but his blood was all it took. If anyone is thirsty," Jesus once said, "let him come to me and drink." Admission of thirst doesn't come easy for us. False fountains pacify our cravings with sugary swallows of pleasure. But there comes a time when pleasure doesn't satisfy. There comes a dark hour in every life when the world caves in and we are left trapped in the rubble of reality, parched and dying. Some would rather die than admit it. Others admit it and escape death. God, I need your help. So the thirsty come. A ragged lot we are, bound together by broken dreams and collapsed promises. Fortunes that were never made, families that were never built, promises that were never kept, wide-eyed children trapped in the basement of our own failures. And we are very thirsty. Not thirsty for fame, possessions, passion, or romance. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Righteousness, that's it. That's what we are thirsty for. We're thirsty for a clean conscience. We crave a clean slate. We yearn for a fresh start. We pray for a hand which will enter the dark cavern of our world and do for us a thing we can't do for ourselves. Make us right again. And that's what happens at the cross. At the cross, Jesus makes us right again. Our sin is imputed to him, his righteousness imputed to us. So every time we gather for communion, it's a reminder to look inward. Remember what Christ has done for you. Remember how he's forgiven you. Remember how he's given you new life. Look back to the cross as well. And then look forward. As often as you do this, do it until he comes again. What a great promise. So I guess when it comes to communion, it's a reminder for all of us to keep our eyes focused on Jesus. When my two boys were little, I took them out into the woods one night, and I even forget what we were doing out there. It's hard to tell. But we all had our flashlights, and we're mountain men now. And we're going out into the woods, and my oldest got scared, which you might expect, because when you're little, 5, 6 years old, the woods are big and scary. And he said something about, aren't we going to get lost? And I said, well, turn off your flashlight. And we turned off our flashlights, and I said, now listen, what do you hear? And finally, we could hear cars out on the road back that way. I said, now look around, what do you see? And we saw lights from a farmhouse across the way. I said, you see, if you just stop and listen, you won't get lost. If you just focus on Christ, you won't get lost, right? Sometimes this world is big and scary, and bad things happen. But if you just stop and be silent and look and listen, keep your eyes focused on the cross. Keep your heart and mind focused on Jesus Christ. And when each of us do that individually, when we come together, there'll be great unity. Christ will be first and foremost. He'll be central in our hearts and our lives. And God will continue to build his church. So as we prepare for communion today, let's take a moment individually. I'll just be silent, and it'll seem like an eternity, but I'll even time it. It won't be more than a minute. But just look inward, look back to the cross, and look ahead to that time when Jesus comes again. Let's be silent before him.